glad that you're here with us. This is the third installment in our Heuermann lecture series for this year. The lecture is in conjunction with the CME Group Foundation sponsored kickoff symposium for the Yider Institute. This is a big deal for Nebraska. It's a big deal for the university, and we have had a great day so far thinking about global trade, international finance, and how trade and finance influences foreign diplomacy and so forth. The theme, as you know, if you've been watching the Heuermann lectures, is really a theme of thinking globally and acting locally. And today we're taking that theme and going forward. The Heuermann lectures are made possible in the Institute of Ag and Natural Resources by a generous donation from Keith and Norma Heuermann. And Keith is here. Keith, would you mind standing so we could say thank you? And really, the Heuermann Lecture Series allows us the opportunity to bring in speakers to Lincoln and explore issues that are definitely related to a growing world, a global food system, thinking about integrated food-animal systems, integrated cropping systems, thinking about community vitality, thinking about the global network, thinking about the human population, which, as we've heard constantly, is growing from where we're at about 7.5 billion to estimated to 9 billion. I was talking with one of our colleagues from Japan. I was just recently there. The U.S. is sitting around 330 million, Japan sitting around 120 million people. We're anticipated here in the States to go up to 360 million, so about a 30 million increase, and Japan is looking at about almost a 30 million decrease. So I find this daunting. If you add up the populations of Japan and the U.S. today, we will be net neutral, as the rest of the world is growing 2 billion citizens. And we have a pretty important role to play in this integrated ecosystem. So just a little bit of rules of the House. The panel will go for about 50 minutes, and then afterward we have 30 minutes set aside for questions. If you're here in Lincoln with us, we will have roving microphones, so just raise your hand. We ask that you use the microphones rather than shouting down, because the entire session is being streamed live and also recorded, and that way we can capture your questions. If you're watching or listening to us via our live stream, you can go ahead and text or tweet, text us. And I'm looking here, where's Jesse? Always look for Jesse. Jesse, what are they to tweet us or text us? HL Series, so # HL Series, and you can tweet us your questions and we'll see that they get asked. So without further ado, let me share a little bit about our panelists. Our first panelist here on my left is Andrea Durkin. Andrea is the founder and principal of Sparkplug, LLC, an independent consulting firm whose clients include Fortune 200 companies in the life sciences, food and agriculture sectors, as well as major industry trade associations. She serves as editor-in-chief of a website launched in September of 2016 called TradeVistas that is dedicated to engaging the public in ways that relate to trade, to our own lives and communities, and recently founded Consensus Learning LLC, which is developing a digital tool to teach trade negotiation skills. I'm looking forward to that. Brian Keel, on the left of Ambassador Vetter. Brian serves as the executive director of Farmers for Free Trade, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting and expanding trade and export opportunities for American farmers and ranchers. It's hard to miss those big buttons at the table. I see some of you are sporting those. Grab one on your way out. Brian also serves as a principal and director of federal affairs for KCO ISM, the nation's leading agriculture accounting and consulting firm. Moderating the panel today is Ambassador Darcy Vetter, a native Nebraskan. Darcy Vetter is the diplomat in residence. As far as I know, Darcy is the first diplomat in residence for the University of Nebraska ever. So big shoes to fill. Darcy has been helping us launch the Clayton Yeutter Institute for International Trade and Finance. And Darcy was a friend, and Clayton was a mentor to Darcy and many people. So that was a special opportunity, and we're so grateful, Darcy, that you joined us on this journey, and today is the culmination of a lot of hard work. Darcy is the former chief agricultural negotiator in the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, where she led bilateral and multilateral or plural lateral or regional trade negotiations on agriculture, including negotiating the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement's agricultural package. She also served in several roles, senior roles at the USDA and with the Senate Finance Committee. So with that, Darcy, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mike. It is my pleasure to be here, and it is such a pleasure to be able to combine this final panel of our symposium on trade and finance at the Yeutter Institute with the Heuermann Lecture, and such a pleasure to have you here, Mr. Heuermann, and good to see you again. Well, our theme for the Yeutter Institute to Symposium was looking at changing governments and changing trade patterns from global to local. And we started with a lunch panel that talked, or a lunch speaker that talked about how big agribusiness companies address these changing trade environments. We then had a conversation among sort of government officials about how countries sort of talk to one another and try and negotiate these terms. But this last panel and our Heuermann lecture today is kind of all about you. This is a practical session to say, now that we've talked for a couple of hours about why trade matters, how can you make sure you're informed about it? And why is it important that you are informed? And then what can you do about it? How can you advocate on your behalf? We heard Kira Lombardo talk about what Smithfield does as a company with lots of staff and a sophisticated process to try and advocate on their behalf and to analyze these trade deals. But frankly, all of us as consumers or farmers or small business people need to know what's happening and what that might mean for our practical decisions too. And I think it is a fair criticism. Whenever we are negotiating new trade agreements, when these changes are being made, there's often an outcry that these deals are being made in secret or behind closed doors, or we're not taking the time to do enough outreach. And it is true that trade has a negotiation language all its own, a lot of terms people don't use, a language that's not easy to understand, and so getting informed can be difficult. And so we are going to take some time today to talk to two people that I know well and respect greatly about their efforts to create tools that will allow people on the one hand to become real informed participants in the trading system through something like TradeVistas, and how to advocate on their own behalf and band together with individual voices to make a difference in trade policy through a group like Farmers for Free Trade. So I want to start by just giving each of them a little bit of time to introduce themselves and what they have developed to help inform and to help advocate. And so, Andrea, we can start maybe with you. If you can give us both an introduction to what TradeVistas is, what it looks like, how you experience it, but then maybe after we've seen what it is, maybe you could take a few minutes to say, why did you do it? Why did you think it was so important that this tool exists?
Okay, well, thank you. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here. I was just saying to Darcy that if I didn't have a family that I loved, I would stay here in Lincoln and not go back to Washington, D.C. It's been a wonderful couple of days. I've had the pleasure of being in 3 different classrooms. I was extremely impressed with the students. They had very specific questions about how trade negotiations are conducted, and it just goes to show you that if you peel away the curtain and you talk to people in very plain language and very directly about how trade policy is made and what their role can be in it and how it affects them, that there is a level of interest there. And that's a lot of the reason why I launched the trade site, the website called TradeVistas. There are flyers outside, and maybe we'll have an opportunity to give you a peek at the website itself. But let me explain a little bit about what it is. We are housed in a think tank in the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington called CSIS. However, I will tell you, as I am one to push the boundaries, it is very unthink tanky in the way we write and who we write for. We're not writing for the inside the Beltway crowd. We're writing for the rest of Americans who aren't practicing trade in their careers every day. And we did launch before the election. This is not a reaction to current trade policy. I think this is something that we've needed in society for some time now. And really, we intended to have sort of a global orientation to this in terms of our readership. But when we heard the kind of rhetoric about trade portrayed in a negative light by all three candidates in the presidential election, we really thought, well, this is out of step. When you look at all of the polls, Pew Research polls over a number of years, it's really out of step with the way average Americans think about trade. In general, the majority of Americans think that trade is good for the US economy and that it's pretty good for their pocketbook, but you wouldn't know that listening to the rhetoric during the election. So we thought it was vitally important that we provide a resource that would be nonpartisan, that would be non-advocacy, that people could grow to trust. And so we created TradeVistas for the general public. The idea is to inform and to empower, to provide context for what you're hearing about on trade policy. I think personally the biggest challenge we have now is that we've gone trade blind. And what I mean by that is we inherently appreciate the benefits of free trade, but we don't attribute those benefits to free trade. And it's time that we kind of bring that back to the forefront and talk about it and talk about the role that trade plays in our daily lives. At the same time, I think our thinking about trade is a little stuck in the past. We often talk about it as if we are all, that countries trade, countries don't trade, people trade, companies trade. And we talk about it as if we're trading finished goods, that everything that goes across the border is somehow a finished good. But the global economy is not that way anymore. Probably 70% or more of what we trade are intermediary goods, right? So that would include inputs to other things that we make. It may be physical inputs, it may be digital trade, digital products, music, for example, movies, things like that. Ideas, we're trading in ideas, we're trading in services. That's all less tangible, but it's really important to kind of bring all of those examples to light so that people appreciate what it is we're actually trading. So what we try to do with TradeVistas is bring that reality to the foreground. We consider that our articles are trying to offer expert insights, but written in plain English. Everything's short. It's 500 to 800 words. I try to be very graphical, pretty colors, eye-catching things. People don't have a lot of time. Everybody here, if you're involved in agriculture, you're busy. You're reading about, the price of your commodity. You're reading about new inputs. I mean, that's all very legitimate. Most Americans are really focused on reading things that are close to their personal lives. So we're trying to grab a few minutes of their time to talk about trade. We're not trying to be perfectly current. We're not chasing the news. My goal is that the content here is evergreen and yet relevant to the current news. So when I say it's evergreen, what I'm thinking of is a library of what we call essentials. So you could go back to our website. We actually put up a piece last summer on Section 232. This is the national security part of the trade law that allows President Trump to impose the steel and aluminum tariffs. We might put graphics up that talk about how many people are in steel producing industries versus industries that use steel as an input. We're not taking a position on it, but you could go back to that content time and again every time you see a story about what's happening and get the 411 on the background on what's happening. We go through academic studies that we think are robust and credible and good and relevant, but we summarize them and we might link you. If you want to go deeper, here's where you go deeper. If you want the 500-word version of it, we'll give you the 500 version of it. We also try to curate trade resources. I'm very well aware that the average person is not going to go research trade data on the Census Bureau website. I can barely wade through that stuff myself. So we try to find tools where people have, like at MIT, they've made a very beautiful tool, a very user-friendly tool, so that you can explore how much of a particular product or service is traded. That's something somebody might actually use, and so we try to find those things, curate it, and put it in a section of the website that we call tools. So we want to be relatable, but we want to be reliable, but we want to be relatable. I was joking with Darcy. I just wrote something on inputs in the textile and apparel value chain, and talked about what makes your yoga pants stretch when you're doing downward dog. Well, let's talk about what that, how textiles get their superpowers. So we'll do that. We'll do, where snowboards made when the Olympics were on, and we'll talk about, what's happening in the sport of, various Olympic sports. We'll try to peg it to something that's, culturally and socially relevant. And then we'll sneak in, the trade policy under the guise of some fun kind of topic. So overall, we want to be uplifting, we want to be optimistic, we want to be entertaining with what we do, but above all, informative and accurate. So.
So that's the information side, that we want to be informed consumers and influencers of policy. I wonder if, Brian, we can turn to you, and if you could tell us a little bit about the advocacy piece, or giving a voice to those folks at the grassroots level who may have real needs when it comes to trade policy. So can you tell us, what is Farmers for Free Trade? What was the genesis behind it? And what do you hope to do with it, and over what time frame?
Sure. Well, thank you, Darcy. So again, my name's Brian Keel. I'm Executive Director of Farmers for Free Trade. Farmers for Free Trade is a nonprofit, a 501c4 nonprofit that's set up as a bipartisan entity. Its honorary co-chairs are Senator Max Baucus, who was chair of the Finance Committee and ambassador to China, Democrat from Montana, and then Senator Lugar, who was chair of the Agricultural Committee, Republican from Indiana. Very important when we founded Farmers for Free Trade, we wanted it to be bipartisan, or even better yet, nonpartisan. That the goal really is to rebuild an American consensus on trade. And totally agree with what Andrea said. You look at the Pew polling, there is a broad understanding in America about how important trade is. But I think that consensus has eroded somewhat. And I think from our perspective, alarmingly, it's eroded within agriculture, which is a little bit of a head scratcher, because if there's one industry in the United States that benefits unambiguously from trade, it's U.S. agriculture. And so the thought that U.S. agriculture has become, in some sectors, somewhat lukewarm on trade seems to be a real problem. And so Farmers for Free Trade was founded last year really in reaction to the 2016 election. And by that, I don't mean that President Trump won the election. What I mean is it was a reaction to the realization that the loser in the election really was trade. That whether you were on the right wing supporting President Trump, or on the left wing supporting Bernie Sanders, or somewhere in the middle, every one of the candidates was saying trade was a bad thing, and that we had to pull out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I mean, it was just a field day on trade. And I think coming out of that, a number of people, sort of organically, from across the spectrum that work in trade, really kind of did a little bit of a reassessment and said, what just happened? How did we get to a place where this trade agreement, which would have opened markets and harmonized standards across Pacific nations, was suddenly seen as a bad thing that we had to pull out of? So Farmers for Free Trade was founded again by Senator Baucus and Senator Lugar. A number of the major ag associations in the United States came together to support this effort. So the American Farm Bureau Federation, the National Pork Producers Council, National Association of Wheat Growers, National Corn Growers Association, CropLife America, as well as multiple ag businesses, individual farmers, other associations, have all sort of pooled resources to say, okay, we need to do some significant spade work. And the vision behind Farmers for Free Trade is that, well, I guess one of the recognitions is that we think the way we got in the pickle that we're in, where trade is not as popular and as understood as it should be, is that we've kind of approached it tactically. And what I mean by that is every time there's a trade agreement that comes up, all of the interest groups in Washington, D.C., and I emphasize it's primarily been an inside the Beltway discussion, they scramble and they'll stand up associations and they'll have a conversation, they'll run ads, they'll say this is a really important trade agreement. And the trade agreement will pass by a few votes in the Senate. And then once the agreement's passed, everyone kind of goes back to their daily lives and forgets about the conversation. And I think the 2016 election was a really wake-up call for a lot of us, saying that's the wrong way to do business, that trade is so integral to U.S. agriculture and so important. We need to have an ongoing dialogue and really do the spade work, both when a trade agreement is up and when there's nothing going on with trade. We need to constantly be talking about trade. So Farmers for Free Trade really is an organization to exist 5 years and 10 years from now, to be talking about trade, working with agriculture, present at ag conventions, working in partnership with ag businesses and ag associations, to really, forgive me for the language, to preach the gospel of trade, to really explain why trade's important. And as critically important as it is to explain why trade's important, even more importantly, I think, give voice to the farmers and the ag producers and the ag businesses that benefit from trade. So help those folks in our industry really speak out and engage. And we have some examples we'll be able to show of how we're doing that.
Excellent. Well, maybe now is a good time for us to have a little bit of fun with it and let the audience experience the products that each of you have created. And I think, Brian, you may be teed up to go
Sure.
first, but maybe you can talk a little bit and show us a bit of what FFT is doing to amplify the pro-trade message.
Sure. So a couple of things that we believe is sort of core principles in the way we've approached Farmers for Free Trade. One is the recognition, and anyone who's in ag understands this, agriculture in the United States is very cultural. I mean, it's a community unto itself. And yes, it's an economy and it's an industry, but ag has a way of talking, ag has a way of relating to each other. I mean, it is a cultural piece of America. And so as we thought about Farmers for Free Trade, one of the things we said is we really need supporters of trade within agriculture to be the validators, to talk to their neighbors, because we know there are people who are skeptical about trade right now, or particularly skeptical about NAFTA. And the way to overcome that in our mind is not so much by throwing statistics and policy out, but to really make trade safe to have a discussion about, and to help people understand sort of at a very personal and grassroots level what trade means and how it benefits all of us. So we've done a couple of things. We've already talked a little bit about the ridiculously big buttons. The I support NAFTA, I'm a farmer for free trade. We also have one that says I support trade. We made these intentionally big, and the reason we made them big is we said let's make it so if you're at an ag convention or a event like this and someone's wearing a button, you can see the button all the way across the room. You don't have to know what it says, you know what it means. So give you an example of how we use these buttons. Farm Bureau Convention in Nashville, literally a week before Christmas, we got a call from American Farm Bureau Federation, who we were working with, and they said, good news, we've just learned Donald Trump is going to be speaking to the Farm Bureau Convention in Nashville. We want you to come in and do a trade overlay to the whole convention. We really want to have this be a pro-trade convention. So we printed 6,000 of these buttons. And in their plenary session on the day before President Trump spoke, we placed these on every seat in the convention hall. So every farmer who was coming in for the Farm Bureau and sitting down had an opportunity to put on a button. And I'd say probably half of them did. There were a lot of buttons we had to collect afterwards, but there were a lot of buttons being worn on lapels. And just the visual impact to be at the Farm Bureau convention and see people walking down the hall wearing these buttons. And then when President Trump spoke, to have a room full of people wearing these buttons was just a very easy way for people to understand what their neighbors thought and what their friends thought. It was a very validating point. We did another thing that I really loved. This was a suggestion from Farm Bureau. We made up a big banner that said, I'm a farmer for free trade. And then Zippy Duvall, the president of Farm Bureau, invited people to come sign the banner. And so we had folks come and sign. This was a 9-foot by 7-foot banner with the Farm Bureau logo and the Farmers for Free Trade logo. We had Sharpie pens in different colors, and we had people come and sign the banner. And I'm not going to pull up the PowerPoint because I don't know if you noticed, we were having some technical difficulties, so I'll wait on that. But visualize this large banner, people signing it. Once again, a very easy way for people at a convention to see that it's being signed, to understand that this is sort of a testament or a petition, if you will, in support of trade. So we've replicated those two ideas, the big buttons and the banners, at ag conventions across the U.S. I think in the last 3 months, We attended 22 or 23 ag conventions, the different pork congresses and the different commodity classic 2 weeks ago. And it's been a really great playbook. It's been a great way to engage people in discussion. Some people won't want to sign the banner, but they'll want to talk about what it means and whether NAFTA is good or not. So it's a great entree point to have a conversation. We've had a lot of fun with the buttons. They've got their own hashtag on Twitter. It's hashtag Big Buttons. And we were pleased at Commodity Classic. Secretary of Agriculture Sonny Perdue donned one of our buttons and had his photo taken with the national wheat growers. And then, in fact, just last night, Governor Ricketts put on his button along with our sponsors and with Christie and your Secretary of Agriculture or Director of the Department of Agriculture. So it's a great way to, again, for people to just express very simply their support of trade. Other things we've been doing, we've thought a lot about how to really engage farmers and people in ag at a very personal level, how to get stories told, because a lot of this is about storytelling. So just today, and I'm pleased that we're able to announce this here at this institute, we're launching something called Voice of the Farmer. And I think it's up on the screen, but I'll give you a little sense. I'm going to play 2 videos. The first video is an ad which we're running on national cable television. And this advertisement, you're seeing it first here today. It'll be running starting tomorrow. It features Michelle Erickson Jones. She's a 4th-generation farmer from Montana. She's the president of the Montana Grain Growers Association and a board member for the National Association of Wheat Growers. And we brought a film crew into Montana to film her story about trade and what it means to her family. And let me just let her say it in her own words.
Generation Montana farmer. We raise cereal grains, oil seeds, alfalfa, and we also have a small cow-calf operation. We're very optimistic about the economy under President Trump. However, we're very concerned about the trade policies from Washington. We depend on free trade policies to maintain our export markets. Crops that we grow here on this farm are exported across the globe. Policies that restrict trade would be devastating for farms like ours. Someday I'd like to pass the farm down to my boys. Mr. President, protect free trade and keep our agriculture economy strong.
So that's a short video. We're going to be doing multiple of these advertisements, but the goal is to, again, allow people to speak personally about trade and what it means to them and tell their story. And one of the things we've done with this Voice of the Farmer campaign, and you'll find this on our website at farmersforfreetrade.com, is we have this very, I think, innovative approach. This is a widget that's embedded in our website that allows people to film videos from their camera on their computer or from their handheld phone. And then we'll curate those videos and we can bundle them onto social media. We can share them with elected officials. We can pass them on sort of en masse. And I'm going to play you one that came in over the weekend. This is, some of you may recognize Randon. He had been the head of the Nebraska wheat growers, I think a couple of years ago. And he made a great little video clip. Let's see if this will play. So again, this was just filmed through his computer and posted up on our website.
I'm Randon Peters. I'm a 5th-generation farmer from McCook, Nebraska. Trade is important to me because 50% of the wheat I grow on my farm is exported to a foreign country. That means every other row grown in this field and every other field on my farm is exported. Our biggest trading partner is Mexico, closely followed by Japan and the Philippines. Without free trade, it'd be hard for me to produce grain in southwest Nebraska and feed the world.
So I love his energy, and our goal is to collect hundreds of these little 30-second spots from all over the United States, from all different types of commodities, and not just from producers, but also from ag businesses. Because when you think about the benefits of trade in the context of agriculture, it's the shipper, it's the port, it's the ag equipment dealer, it's the ag equipment manufacturer. We have supply chains that benefit from trade. And so our goal is to really tell the story throughout those supply chains and use that as a way to talk to our governors, talk to our elected officials. One of the things we've been really trying to do with these types of stories is keep it local. So a lot of our conversations have been with governors and commissioners or directors of departments of ag. Very pleased to see Governor Ricketts do his proclamation earlier today. We've received similar proclamations from a number of governors around the United States, Democrat and Republican governors. And we think that's really telling when you start to see governors who are very connected to the people in their state saying, wait a minute, agricultural trade is really important to me. So we're hoping in our own small way, we're helping to move the needle on this dialogue and really kind of open some eyes about what trade means to agriculture.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to offer the same thing now to you, Andrea. I know. I hope that our technology...
We can try.
Yes, we can do a little switcheroo
Oh, wait a minute.
here.
Hold on. No, hold on. Bring everything
People
with you.
in the IT booth are just pulling their hair out right now.
Forgive us.
Striking fear in their hearts. But maybe you can give us a little bit of an experience of what TradeVistas looks like and how we would each go and learn about what are these words you see being thrown about in trade and what do they mean?
Can we see it? Oh, good. Okay, so all I want to do is show you kind of the look and feel of this site. The way we're organized, we have features. I call them features just because I didn't know what other category to put them in, but they're basically articles on anything. It can be on the steel tariffs, for example. The things that we're calling essentials, I'm going to flip over here and show you essentials. That's what I described to you are explanations and discussions about core concepts in trade. It might be things like the principles of most favored nation and national treatment, so that you understand, that the average reader can understand that these are the two core principles of the trading system. Here we're attempting to explain in a series investor-state dispute settlement provisions. Now, that may be something that isn't frequently heard, or it's not used by the average person. These are typically very large investments. The disputes are infrequent, but it's becoming one of those core things in the NAFTA negotiations that we're going to get stuck on. So you may start hearing about it. So we try to anticipate some of those things and populate the website with very short pieces on all of those things. And you can see we try to have fun with our visuals, trying to think, oh, here's a fun one. All right, so substantial transformation. I think you're probably all pretty familiar with the concept. How do you assess rules of origin? Well, it depends on where the product was last substantially transformed, where it changed. So we used Megatron, the Transformers, as sort of the hook to get the reader in to talk about. And actually, this was a story about how, it was actually a story about content. So it's really deceiving to kind of think about the trade deficit in terms of those kind of numbers, where you don't want to look at the made in label. It just doesn't tell you anything anymore. So the point we were trying to make with with Megatron was that he might say made in China, but he's actually, 90% of the value, if not more, actually was created between Tokyo and Hasbro in New Jersey, where they're designing Megatron and figuring out how he can, how his parts can move and what materials he should be made of. So all of that intellectual capacity and value creation was happening in the United States and in Japan, even though he carries the label made in China. So it's a simple concept. We're not trying to overload, but we're trying to use some fun imagery like this. Journeys. So, whoops, okay. Journeys are stories about people, about products, and the international journey that they go on. Because virtually everything, I think one of the gentlemen earlier asked a question, said, well, I'm a farmer, I'm not involved in trade. Well, yeah, you are actually. Chances are, the inputs you buy had a global journey. The machinery that you use had a global journey. The product that you make, even if you may not be selling internationally, may find its way into the international market. So we're trying to tell stories about products that are things that we are very familiar with, like chocolate. That was a pretty popular post. So we were thanking Mexico for giving us the gift of chocolate. We were talking about snowboarding. We were talking about wedding rings. That was a very popular millennial post. Pumpkin spice latte. So we'll take any of those kinds of topics and find a trade angle. And really the point is to try to encourage everybody to start thinking that way, to look around, look in your closet, to look in your kitchen and the appliances that you're using, the washing machine, everything you come in contact with on a daily basis. We can write a trade piece about it because there is some trade angle, some trade story, some facet of trade policy that we can address through those posts. And then lastly, I'll just show you that The last piece on the website, actually not lastly, I'll just show you. So the tools, I mentioned tools, so these are the curated resources. I have friends in Washington who send me angry notes that they spent, an hour of their day tooling around some of these things that I've posted, and they got off what they were supposed to be doing. And then lastly, so, look to this website if you're trying to look for statistics. We do try to make it easy for you to find what you're looking for. The last thing I want to point out to you is our About page. And the reason I'm going to go there, we might actually have a video just starting.
Good ideas, packaged up as the things we buy and sell every day, move around the world constantly. We may not always be aware of it, but international trade is part of our daily lives, whether you live in Southeast Asia or Des Moines, Iowa. It's easier than ever to trade with anyone, almost anywhere in the world. But as familiar as trade is, few other topics carry as much heated rhetoric or conflicting claims. That's why we created TradeVistas. The team at TradeVistas is dedicated to providing clarity and context for the global conversation about trade. We strive to bring you analysis, insights, and data from the impact of technologies that shape our jobs and our economy to the stories behind the products and services that are part of your life. Join us for this important conversation at TradeVistas.
So I would love it if you have stories that you want to share and feature on TradeVistas. Be happy to take those suggestions. The reason I came to this page is because I wanted to show you that we have a board, and it's not your typical board. If you look at these faces, one thing should leap out at you, which is these are young people. They are much younger than I am. And we did that on purpose. I mean, we could have reached out to former USTRs. We could have reached out to luminaries and people with big titles, like our friend over here. And we didn't, because we really believed that it's millennials talk about trade differently. They think about trade differently. The polling, in terms of their views on trade, is sky high. And just in terms of sheer numbers of our population, it's important to give them a voice. So we are trying to listen to what they have to say about what we should be doing at TradeVistas, but also take their contributions, their writing contributions. They are trying to tell us how we should be on social media, because I personally don't have social media accounts, so they're teaching me a lot about that, but that's where we need to be reaching people. And so I'm just, thrilled that they're excited about being a part of it. And I'm convinced that, campuses like this are really where we should be, where we should be talking to young people and giving them a platform for using their voice on trade.
Can I pick up on one of the things you just said, which is that they write for TradeVistas. Yes. So who produces your content? Who can produce your content? And how are you using that as an information tool too?
It's a tricky balancing act, because in some cases they haven't had enough experience or expertise to kind of write on certain topics. So we go to friends, we go to trade lawyers, we go to people who are expert in these topics, but the key is, and it's really hard to find these people, because in Washington everybody wants to look smart. Everybody thinks the way to get play for your articles is to say something very provocative, very partisan, and we don't do that. So we have to find people who are giving. We have to find people who are generous with their knowledge and their expertise and can write in an entertaining way, and that's a tricky balance to be had. Increasingly, as people have read us, I've had more and more young people say, I would love to write for you, and they are good at it, and so we typically we have them explore topics that are important to them. Lauren here, who's actually pictured, she wrote the piece on engagement rings. I suspect, and she told me about a month later, that her boyfriend proposed to her, so I suspect she may have had research lying around the table that may have pushed that a little long, but if they write about things that are interesting to them, she wrote a La Croix piece too. She said, there's this dispute we're having on agriculture with Europeans, and it's older than millennials themselves, and it could affect my sparkling water because it could retaliate. And so, you get them to think about it that way, then the writing's easy. So it's a little bit of work, to get to the right sort of voice that we want to appeal to everybody. But I'm really encouraged by the fact that I have many more young people writing, a lot of students, and in fact, we're working on allowing students to get credit. So we work with the Mercatus Center in Washington. They're economists, young economists, and the program will allow them to fulfill their 20-hour work credit if they do research and write a piece for TradeVistas. So we're trying to come up with creative partnerships because we don't have very much money, I'll be honest. So, you know, we'll take content from really good sources, but we have to be really creative about it. But the whole point is engagement. It's not about us pushing content out. I don't want the site to be all about us pushing content out. I do want that engagement. So the more people want to write and contribute their stories, we're happy to have it.
Well, I love that concept, that the whole purpose of the website is to inform and teach, but in the process of creating it, you're using it as a teaching tool as well. And I think that's something for us all to think about as we try and advance the trade conversation. So I wanted to take a minute to highlight that. Brian, if I can go to you for a minute. You know, you highlighted the fact that the Voice of the Farmer campaign is sort of the latest thing that FFT is doing. And I'd like you to comment a little bit on why you think at this moment we're in politically that individual voices are particularly important, but then also would ask you whether you've encountered some hesitation from farmers who have that story to tell about speaking up, and how is FFT helping to counter that a little bit?
Boy, that's both great questions, Darcy. You know, the moment in time, I mean, I think there's sort of two factors that are informing how we're operating. You know, number one, when we were founded, we said, okay, clearly there's a challenge that needs to be addressed. It's a systemic problem. It's not a President Trump is the president and has bad trade policies moment. It was, we've lost something in America. We've lost an understanding of trade. Again, whether left or right across the spectrum, we need to rebuild that consensus. So when we launched Farmers for Free Trade, it was really with that vision of a long-term perspective. Now, obviously, as we've operated Farmers for Free Trade, the world hasn't stood still. There have been a few things happening. We've had NAFTA, well, we've had first TPP pull out before we founded Farmers for Free Trade. Then the NAFTA negotiations. And so the way we engaged in NAFTA negotiations was really to say, look, we want to see NAFTA negotiations wrap up successfully. We don't think we should be calling for a pullout of NAFTA. We think it's appropriate that you'd modernize NAFTA and try to improve it where you can. And the U.S., like every country, should try to get as good a deal as it can, but all within the context of these are important trading partners and we'd like to see this negotiation wrap up. One of the reasons we want to see it wrap up is because we want to be more proactive. We want to see the U.S. engaging in other countries and trying to open other countries for trade exports. Then obviously we had the steel and aluminum tariff discussion, which is rolling out as we speak, causing a lot of anxiety within ag, and causing anxiety for two reasons. One is import costs are already starting to go up, whether it's the cost of grain bins or other inputs. We're already seeing an effect on our farmers' bottom line. And then two is what's the possibility of retaliation? You know, Farmers for Free Trade put out a report 2 weeks ago looking at the history of retaliation in the United States. When we get into a trade spat, how do countries retaliate against the United States? 9 times out of 10, they retaliate against U.S. agriculture. And they do it for a couple of reasons. I think one, it's a politically viable group. There's no constituency in the U.S. that's more politically charged when it wants to be than U.S. agriculture. You know, it's a compelling entity. People want to stand with ag. So that's one reason why I think, ironically, we get the brunt of retaliation, is people know that we will get politically fired up. I think number two is a lot of our products are perishable. So when you look at some of the retaliatory measures, they're against products that can't just stick around for a year if they don't sell. That's another reason it's politically sensitive. So retaliation's a big concern coming out of these steel and aluminum tariffs. So your question was specifically how we're deciding to do this, sort of the voice of the farmer right now. And I think part of what we're trying to do is cut through the chatter. You know, there's this challenge in America right now about what is fake news. What's your source of information? You know, do you watch MSNBC or do you watch Fox? And if you're in Clan A, you think Clan B's a bunch of liars. And if you're in Clan B, you think Clan A's a bunch of liars. And I don't think we're going to make a lot of headway in this discussion by trying to go through those types of news channels. So I think just the same way that President Trump has decided to go around it with direct Twitter feeds to people, part of our view is, all right, we need to just make this very real and authentic and as grounded as we can. It needs to be about the voice of the farmer, because there's no denying, you saw Randon Peters up there. Randon Peters lives down the road. I mean, there's no question who he is and what he believes. And the more that we can tell stories at that level, we think the more effective we're going to be at changing a national dialogue. What was the second part of your question, Darcy?
Second part of the question was whether you've seen some hesitation about speaking up, and how is FFT countering some of that? Is there some concern about being outspoken on policies?
Well, absolutely. And let me call out the elephant in the room, which is farmland, farm country in the United States supported President Trump very strongly. And yet right now what President Trump is doing, whether it's NAFTA or TPP pullout or tariffs, has the potential to do real damage to agriculture. And so we've got kind of this, to use a psychological phrase, cognitive dissonance going on right now, because we're sitting here saying, but we like what Trump has done on regulations. We like deregulation. That's a good thing for us, right? And we like some of the judges he might have put on the courts. I mean, this is sort of a dialogue that's happening in rural America. But we are uncomfortable about what's happening on trade, just like Michelle Jones said in the ad. And so I think I'll just speak for myself for a moment. I think what has happened is, when you think about politics, smart political people who run campaigns during the 2016 election and going back said there are a lot of votes in Pennsylvania. And there's a lot of votes in Michigan. And we can pick up those votes, and if we can swing those states on trade, we're going to win, whether it's the Democratic primary or the general election. And I think what's been lost in that discussion is, how does that affect rural America? We don't have factories that we have ribbon cuttings. I mean, we'll have an ethanol plant, or we might have an ag manufacturing in Nebraska, center pivots. I mean, we certainly have industry that gets affected. But it's not the same thing. You don't get the glamour of a car factory opening. But, as the good Lord is my witness, our industry gets affected every bit as much or more so. The dollars that are at stake, the jobs that are at stake, the ripple effect through our economy and through our communities is every bit as powerful. And I think that's part of what's happened, is there's been a disconnect. And I think we need to work to reconnect that with President Trump. I think he needs to understand what's at stake, and that people who supported him are at stake and are asking for his help. And beyond President Trump, in the 2018 election and the 2020 election, we need to make sure that politicians don't think the easy route to election is beat up on trade. They need to understand that trade really does matter for our rural communities. It matters for our main streets. It matters for our families. And people need to support trade in order to help rural America.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I will say that Farmers for Free Trade brought some farmers in to talk on the margins of the Montreal round of the NAFTA negotiations. And we just heard in this room that countries don't trade, people do. And that the impact of losing some of that trade on economies is going, what it will mean for farmers' pocketbooks. And I could say that 20 times, but I'm the swamp, right? Like the title I wear, the fact that I've been in DC for so long, there will be people who just discount that, or who say it's facts and figures and it's too hard in your head. One of the most effective pieces of trade advocacy I've ever seen was a rice farmer from Texas that Farmers for Free Trade brought to talk to the media on the margins of this. And he said two phrases I remembered really well. He said, "I don't trade with Mexico, I trade with Jose." And we've been trading with each other for 20 plus years. He's been my customer for that long. And if suddenly those terms of trade change, I'd rather not do business somewhere else, but I don't know that I can afford to keep doing it the way I've been doing it. Simple, true, incredibly effective demonstration of what trade actually looks like between our countries. And then someone else asked him, with these commodity prices where they are, if you lost this market to Mexico and they went down further, what would you do? He said, well, for the past couple of years, I've been trying to do some things to raise some extra income. I've been mending fences for neighbors. I dedicated a few acres to a different crop that might get me into a slightly different market. I'm just trying to be resourceful. But I can only be so resourceful before I have to make some bigger decisions about what I do in my operation. Incredibly effective and visual and true things about what people do to make ends meet. And it is important to have the economic charts and graphs and to have, all of the, what is the cumulative effect. But I just thought, I wish I could take you everywhere with me to say, this is what this means. And it was completely unassuming, just sort of, well, here's how I'm dealing with it. And I can't get it out of my head. So, I hope to see more of those things on that website. It really meant a lot. At this point, I think let's throw it open and talk a little bit about the tools that you've seen, but also just sort of the bigger context on trade. Both of these panelists are real experts in their own right on a lot of these things, and so just would see, are there questions from the audience? And again, please use those microphones so that others can hear your question. Don't be that good. Question up here.
Hello. How are you addressing, we got free trade, but fair trade? There's, as far as I've got a cow-calf operation in Hyannis, if my beef gets mixed in with something out of Brazil, that they plant the label of U.S. meat, but it's not all U.S. meat. It seems unfair to me, so that's why I want to. How are they addressing the fair trade? I hear about the stuff, our product goes into the other countries, but their product coming in, or vice versa, it gets the value of it is different.
Mm-hmm. Can I take that?
You're talking about the tariff differentials that President Trump has referred to. I think the first point I would make about the word fair trade is that there isn't really a definition for it. So that part of our dilemma in the way we refer to free or fair trade is that we actually have neither. there's no real definition even of, we don't have free trade. Countries still have all sorts of behind the border restrictions in terms of standards and regulatory barriers. Certainly in agriculture, we still have a variety of historical distortions in the form of tariffs, in the form of tariff rate quotas, subsidies that we still haven't really negotiated on a multilateral basis over. So certainly in the realm of agriculture, and this is more Darcy's area because I didn't negotiate on agriculture, but we have not covered that segment of global trade in global trade negotiations to the degree that we have covered non-agricultural goods. And as well, we haven't covered services. So there's a huge swath of trade, of forms of trade and products that we trade that we still haven't liberalized to a great degree through these negotiations. That means that things got kind of frozen in place at a certain point in time as to what levels we may have negotiated, in terms of these tariffs. So, the only way to get around that is to enter into more negotiations. And there's lots of legitimate debate over how you do that. What's more efficient? What's more effective? Is bilateral more effective because you can get maybe a better deal, lower tariffs in a shorter period of time? Possibly. They're time intensive. There's politics involved in that. There's all sorts of considerations, but all of it comes down to the choices that you make from a policy perspective. And I think, no doubt, there's still a lot on the table. We don't have free trade. We're not free traders. We have a long way to go to get to that kind of status if we go in that direction. So I think it's a legitimate conversation to be having. I don't have an answer for it, but I'd like to see us have a very fact-based conversation about it instead of hyperbole. That's kind of the dilemma that we're in right now.
And I would say, as an agriculture negotiator, that's a question you get a lot. And we are a huge ag exporter, but we are also the largest food importer in the world. And that has, in many ways, been very good for U.S. diets. That's why we eat strawberries in December and fresh fruits and vegetables year-round. But that also means we're competing on our own territory and we're competing in the global territory. And so while it may not seem fair that the Brazilians have the same access to the U.S. market as you do, I bet the Brazilian beef farmers don't think it's very fair that you also have that access to their market or other markets in the world. And so if we want, and that's sometimes difficult to say, we're going to share and take an open philosophy because we want to encourage others to do the same, or because we want to be able to hold others accountable to meeting those same rules. But that doesn't mean that, yes, you might face some increased competition. But that, in the conversation we had earlier today about the importance of that global system and about having standards and a way to enforce them, if that Brazilian beef is going to come in, we want to make sure it's fairly priced and not, priced in a way that's meant to undercut your product. We want to make sure that it's actually safe and that it's appropriately inspected, that we have confidence in their system, that it meets those standards. And that, of course, has been a recent issue in the news with Brazilian beef. And we want to make sure it's properly labeled according to what is U.S. law, but also according to what is international trade rules. And if we can make sure that we're holding that product to the same standard that we would hold our own product to, well, then we've tried to create fairness in the terms of competition. But it absolutely is the case that as global commerce increases and supply chains get more and more global, that may mean you're competing with whole classes of product that you didn't compete with before. And I think that's always hard, and we have to think about better and more innovative ways that we can do that. But governments have a challenge of making sure that those standards are applied and that we require the same thing of our trading partners, so that we're not just playing by the rules and taking foreign product, but not asking other countries to also play by the rules and to correct some wrongs when we feel they are prohibiting our products. And it's a delicate dance. It's a continuing conversation because new issues arise all the time. But suggesting that opening our market is somehow unfair, I don't think that's quite the right case either, because other countries tend to respond in kind. So we have to get that balance right and make sure that products are offered in the marketplace under the appropriate conditions, whether it's other products coming to us or our products going there.
I think I would just add one more thing, which is I think my perspective over time has certainly shifted in terms of the weight that I give trade policy, because certainly when you're in the middle of it and you're negotiating trade agreements, you want to think that you can solve every problem. Trade policy doesn't actually, and it's not forward-looking. Trade policy is reactive. We negotiate solutions to problems that the private sector brings to us because we don't know business, we don't know your business, we don't know daily transactions, we don't know how the modern economy is changing, and it's changing very fast. So it is by its very nature reactive, which means it's imperfect. So you're constantly trying to figure out, how do we solve this commercial problem that somebody has brought to us?
That's a very, very good point. Are there other questions from the audience?
You touched on a little bit with your Transformers example, the intellectual value of trade. I guess I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, such as how you would figure that and the effect it would have on business, and then also how that will be incorporated into future trade deals.
That's a really great question. And I don't know how to answer the third part of it, but there's a couple of different things that in your question. Number one, almost everything has a global value chain. Almost every product or service we create or use has some kind of global value chain attached to it. And the real question for us is, where do we want to be in that value chain? Where is the most value added to that product? Where are the best jobs in the creation of that product? China has a problem, actually. When you look at the smile curve, basically there's a huge amount of value created on the front end of something where you've got R&D and engineering and branding and marketing and all these things. And you move slowly down along the curve. Less value is added along the way to the point where you've got sort of assembly, just pure assembly down here. So you've got high value inputs, you've got assembly, that's at the very bottom. And then you start coming back up the curve and you get back into high value activities like retailing and marketing and distribution and all of that on that end, which we tend to excel at these two sides of that value chain, at the high ends of that smile curve. That's a really good place for us to be. That's where most of the value is created. Some of the classic example, one of the classic ones is the iPhone. So, 70% of our iPhones come from China, but very little value is added in China. something like, I don't know, I think it may be upwards of 90% of the value of that phone was created in the United States. And if you think about all of the Apple geniuses in the stores and the construction jobs associated with the stores, you may not think of a construction job, somebody who's building an Apple store, as that person's job being related to trade, but it was. It was. It's related to the fact that Apple has massive global sales of their phones, and they're able to leverage these value chains so that their product is, invented in one place. And the glass may come from New Jersey, but some of the semiconductor may come from South Korea, and it's moving along that value chain. But we shouldn't worry about the fact that it says made in China. The unfortunate part, you said, how do we value it? How do we count it? The unfortunate part in terms of the accounting of this is that 100% of that value will count toward Chinese exports to the United States. So think about that. How reliable is that data? How do you want, we shouldn't be using this sort of accounting data to think about how well we're doing in global trade. Because if I just told you that 90% of the value of that Apple phone was created here, that unfortunately is not showing up in our trade statistics. What's happening now is that in the OECD and the WTO, they are looking at new ways to calculate trade and value added. If you were to calculate trade and value added and relook at the US-Mexico deficit, the deficit we run with Mexico would drop by 90% just by sheer math, sheer accounting. Because now you've accounted for value, the value that was created in the United States that may be coming back to the United States in the form of that finished product. So it's a little bit deceiving, and unfortunately we don't know how to count it really well, and it's going to require coming to some international consensus on how we change the way we count things so that we feel better about the accounting of things.
Excellent. Are there other questions? I think we had one.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. The gentleman behind you has the microphone, and we'll catch you next. There you go. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. You mentioned a minute ago about dealing with real-world situations. Last year, there was a lot of press made over the opening of the China markets for our beef. And I'm a cow-calf raiser. We retain ownership on our cattle, and they're fed out not very far away. And I've participated in source and age verification programs in the past, value added. So I saw this opportunity as, and listening to the rhetoric about what a tremendous potential market there is for our high quality Nebraska beef. So I started checking into what it would take to qualify. And I got the numbers, I got the figures, and let it sit for a little while until it came time this winter to send our steers to the feedlot. And then I got really serious about it because you have to identify them before they leave the place. And I was checking before I started pulling the trigger on all the expenses involved. I wanted to find out what's the premium on the other end going to be. Is it going to cover my expenses? And I'm in central Nebraska, and lo and behold, there were only 2 sources within 200 miles for that beef to go to China. One was 200 miles away, one was 60 miles away. The one 200 miles away said that you have to basically reserve chain space a year ahead of time for what little we do trade. And the other one that was closer said that your cattle have to be black-hided or we don't even mess with it. So then I talked to the feedlot folks, and the feedlot folks said that we don't participate because we cannot recover what it costs us in feed expenses from what we're going to get for that beef. So I'm sensing the water starts backing up. So it gets back to me and my cost for enrolling, because this is where it starts. And it didn't take very long for me to find out that it does not pay me to qualify my cattle and start these cattle down the river to end up in China, because there's no market there, at least not for yet. And so my question to you folks for international trade, and you were talking about the China smile, how do we make the rubber meet the road? Because this sounds like a great program for Nebraska beef and beef in general, but the revenue is not there in this capitalistic society for folks like me to take advantage of it. I'd love to.
Sure. Should I?
Sure, toss it to the farmer.
Miss Ag Negotiator, please take
So
that.
this is an issue I worked on for about 8 years, trying to reopen that market. And Andrea's right, we don't have free trade. Ideally, what the Chinese would say is, we've looked at your system, and the beef that you're producing is safe, and therefore, if it's produced according to US standards, we will simply take it. You know, that you might have to verify the chain of custody and fill out all the right customs forms and do the normal things, and we'll take it. The reality is that's been a very sticky market and a hard one to open, and they attach several conditions to it. And so the opportunity is there. It is a huge beef market, but you would have to have the correct economies of scale and the ability to track and trace in order to take advantage of it. It is imperfect. But as a US government official, do you say, I'm going to wait until it is perfect, knowing how, you know, it's taken decades to reopen these beef markets since our outbreak of BSE, or do you say, I'm going to crack open that market with this now, with the understanding that as the Chinese consumer starts to experience more of that US beef, that maybe over time the barriers to that trade might come down. And those are hard choices, because you don't, I mean, the goal as a government official is to say, I want the US beef sector to benefit from this. But in reality, the opportunity that you could negotiate at that time means that a subsector of that of those farmers probably can participate or are able to meet all of those conditions. And I mean, the reality is that you are almost always negotiating under imperfect conditions, and sometimes there are trade-offs to be made. But it is also true in commodity markets. And I think Kira talked about this at lunch, if you had the opportunity to be at the lunch panel, that if you take a segment of that beef off of the US market and can move it to the foreign consumer, the impact on overall commodity price might be more positive for the beef that you sell here. So you have to keep all of those things in mind, and at which point is there enough of the demand in China that we could fill? Is the protocol onerous, but not too onerous that it actually will allow enough of a volume to flow? And there's not a systematic answer. It's what's available, what's the best deal you can get given the situation at the time. It's often a very sort of practical call, and I did not negotiate that beef protocol. That was done after I left government, but I'm quite familiar with, you know, trying to make the list of what are the trade-offs here, and is it a go or is it not? So unfortunately, I don't think your situation is all that uncommon, but sometimes farmers know this better than anyone, right? You make do with what you have at the time that you have it, and I think this is partly an example of that. All right, do we have time for one more, I think?
This is really along the line of communications. I'm pleased to hear what you're trying to do, because it's a communication issue. One of the things that I see as a problem from athletics, it's crept over into whatever we're doing in every part of society. It's a win or lose. No one wants to be in the middle. I mean, we smash each other in football, and we pop each other and this and that in basketball, and it might be 2 points. And that's what I think the American public and all of us really have come to believe. You know, you got to win. And if you didn't win, you've lost. And I don't know. I think that's your area.
And I want to talk to that, just because we took a delegation to Mexico. I'll back up just a little bit with the story, because I think it's kind of a neat story. So I mentioned we had a group of people that went to Commodity Classic 2 weeks ago, or maybe it's 3 weeks ago now. And we had our big banner, and actually the Commodity Classic banner was, I think, 11 feet long, because we had so many different logos. We had, you know, Association of Equipment Manufacturers and wheat and soy. Everyone signed it. We distributed buttons. Sonny Perdue was there and wore the button, as I mentioned. We then took the banner on a plane down to Mexico with a number of farmers, had a press conference in Mexico with our farmers talking about the importance of trade to U.S. agriculture. And unlike the Canada round that Darcy mentioned with the farmer from Texas, which was great, we thought for Mexico we wanted to change it up a little bit. And so what we did is we talked about the importance of integrated supply chains to U.S. agriculture and really tried to emphasize it is just fundamentally wrong to talk about trade as I win, you lose, you win, I lose. That's not the way the world works anymore, and I think we've heard that here. One of the great examples we had a farmer, Herb Karst from Montana, barley farmer. He raises barley. It gets shipped down to Mexico. It gets turned into Corona beer, which gets shipped back. And as he put it, he sits at his table in Montana and he drinks a Corona beer and he's darn happy doing it, knowing that it's his product that's in that bottle. And so, you know, the thought that, well, because we're shipping barley to Mexico, someone in Mexico has to be losing is wrong. And the reason that they're shipping beer here means we're losing is wrong. And to me, one of the really interesting things over the last couple negotiations, and again, we've just been on the sidelines bringing farmers in, trying to, you know, raise our voice where we can. But we've met with farmers from Canada and we've met with farmers from Mexico. Now, there are dairy issues with Canada and the U.S. dairy. I mean, you know, they're not to belittle that there are issues between ag. But having said that, one of the things that's been surprising to me is how much ag in all three countries supports NAFTA. It's kind of a head scratcher when you first encounter it, because you say, well, geez, if the U.S. is doing so well and we're exporting so much product, why are they happy? And you realize because this isn't a zero-sum game. You know, the corn that the Mexican farmers are growing is for their consumption. The corn that we're growing and shipping is for feed. And they're not necessarily in conflict. And so it's kind of heartening to see that there is space in this dialogue where it's not zero-sum and that farmers north of the border, south of the border, and here are all in agreement. NAFTA's been a good thing for all of us. One of the reasons it's been a good thing for all of us too is because it's made us an efficient trading bloc. We're now one of the largest trading blocs, if not the largest trading bloc in the world. We have efficient supply chains across the borders. When we were in Mexico, we had one of the farmers who was talking with us was a potato farmer from Canada, just across the border in Canada. All of his ag inputs, all of his ag equipment comes from the U.S. I mean, he's right there. He's not purchasing stuff in Canada, he's purchasing it in the U.S. But he's growing potatoes that say, you know, made in Canada or grown in Canada. These efficient supply chains really help us compete everywhere. And that's something that I think we all have to embrace and understand. You know, we can win by doing things better together.
Very nice.
One small anecdote. It's a non-agricultural anecdote, and I put it up here. I see. It's like I'm not in my microphone. I speak that way. It's Etsy. So we did a piece on this. If you think about the way we try to think about trade is to fuel expansion of the global economy. Everybody wants to grow. It's good for us when India grows because they can buy more stuff from us. It's good when we grow. And if you look at an example like Etsy or any of the sort of internet-based platforms that people are selling stuff on, like eBay, 15 million Americans earned a collective $6 billion on 9 different internet platforms. These are people who, for the most part, they're very small. Most of them are businesses of one, operating out of their homes, full-time, most of them, not as a side gig. And that opportunity would not have existed if the internet didn't exist. So now they can create a website, sell to anybody, anywhere in the world, because shipping costs are low, and the cost of advertising is pretty low. And here you've got all of these different jobs, these are full jobs, created out of nowhere because of the internet. And this is what's happening with technological change. So it really isn't about chasing a certain number of opportunities. It's about creating more opportunities for everybody.
Excellent. Okay, that's a good note to end on, Andrea.
Fantastic. Fantastic. So that concludes our panel. Before we turn the podium over to Chancellor Ronnie Green for some thoughts and reflections, I would like to let's say thanks to Andrea and to Brian and to Darcy. Thank you. And as a token of our appreciation, Darcy already has one of these. I present to you the Heuermann Lecture Medal. Thank you very much.